Welcome back to Sunday Morning Cafe, our ongoing conversation about building and maintaining resilience in challenging times. This week, you're joining me on my back porch so that we're not out in the rain, but we still get to be outside. What do you think of this story? So she got divorced a couple years earlier, and she went to counseling and did her work. Made it all the way through the grieving process, and she was ready. So she got on that dating website and got the profile she was hoping for, lines up the dinner date, dresses to the nines, walks through the door and finds that this man is so easy on the eyes. And they fall into dinner conversation, and it's flowing and it's fun. He's interesting, he's interested in her, and everything's going well until he gets up to use the restroom and he doesn't come back. She's devastated. She drives home and she's determined to call her best friend and to hash it out with her. And her best friend says to her, "You know, I don't know what you were expecting, but have you looked in the mirror lately? Your hips are way wider than you thought they were. And you think you're good at conversation? Nah, you're not good at conversation." Can you imagine? Can you imagine how devastating that would feel? A story I'd like to share with you from a different place is when I first moved to St. Louis. When I got here, and by the way, St. Louis is where we're filming this from. When I got here, I was convinced that the founders of this city got together over scotch and put together the road system. I mean, some roads run diagonally, some run in a circle. The names of the streets change partway through, and I wasn't that great at directions to start with. So there I'd be in the car, and here was the thing that would happen time and again. I'd be driving along, and I'd be lost. I'd catch myself pounding the steering wheel and saying, "Wagner, you dumbass." Now, just imagine for a second that your best friend is sitting in the car next to you, and about the time you get lost, screams at you and calls you a dumbass. Imagine the feeling that would go with that. Cognitive psychologists have noticed that kind of thing over and over again. So the word cognosco in Latin means I think. So cognitive psychology has noticed that when you're having a painful emotion, very difficult to decide that emotion away. Just try it for a second. You ever felt jealous? Try to push that out. No, there it is. But what they have noticed is while you can't change the painful feeling, what you can notice are the thoughts that attend that difficult feeling. And then when noticing that thought, if you notice it's the least bit negative or the least bit unrealistic, you can change that thought ever so little to make it more positive. In my story about banging the steering wheel, around that time I got myself to a cognitive psychologist. And what I learned how to do was to change that thought slightly like this. "Tom, it's true you're not great at directions, but you're not a dumbass. There's many things you are good at. And you're learning to get better at directions. Check that out." Notice what I didn't say. "Tom, you're awesome at directions." That wouldn't have been true. Changing it ever so slightly, do you catch the change in that mood? Back to my story about this woman. You know, her friend never said that to her. But can you imagine those are the things that woman was saying to herself? See how that works? All techniques in cognitive psychology start the same way. They have you take a step back and notice the thought that you are entertaining or the conversation you're having with yourself or the story that you've created out of what's happening, to take a step back and notice that and determine, is that a little bit too negative or a little bit unrealistic, and to change it ever so slightly. So what I'd like to offer you today, just a few techniques from cognitive psychology, so that after you've done your step back process and notice the thought you're having, or notice the story that you're constructing about what's happening in the world, that you can have some say-so about how you construct that or the thoughts that you're going to allow to rent space in your head. The first technique I'd like to start with, I'm going to take from the mindfulness approach to cognitive psychology. So having noticed the thought that I'm thinking right now, or the internal dialogue I'm having with myself, I'm going to ask this question: is that thought useful? And if I look at that thought and say, no, it's not useful, then the next thing I do is say out loud to myself, I surrender that thought, or I let that thought go. For those who have a spiritual approach to life, I would introduce for you something that's along the same lines. Reinhold Niebuhr was a great American theologian, and he wrote this prayer. You've heard it maybe, the Serenity Prayer. All kinds of 12-step meetings, including Alcoholics Anonymous, they use that prayer. It goes like this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. What is it but a sorting prayer? It's sorting out those things I can't change and those things I can change. Having determined that I can change it, then it's time to sit down and construct a plan to change it. But if it falls into the other side of the equation, something that I can't change, the next step in the process is to use this kind of prayer. God, I give that thought to you. And to do it out loud, or to close your eyes and visualize giving that thought to God, or God, I surrender that thought to you. Having done that, the human tendency is to take that thought back out of God's hands and to cling to it yourself. So the trick is, God, I give that thought to you, and then the second step is to put your mind back on whatever you were thinking about right before you had that thought. If you were vacuuming the carpet, get back to that. If you were doing your taxes, you get back to the figures on your page. If the thought's really, really sticky and it keeps coming back, what I'd invite you to do is a technique like this. With your fingers, name 10 things you can see with your eyes in the room where you are. Having named those 10 things, name 9 more things that you didn't say already. Then name 8 more and 7 more, all the way down to 1, until you're fully in this place and not engaged with that thought in your head. You might find that you'll say, God, I give that thought to you, and 5 minutes later it's back. Do the process again. An hour after that it's back. Do the process again. 2 hours later it's back. Do the process again. By the end of the day, you may have prayed that prayer 20 times. Most traditions would say, prayer is good, worry's not so good. So that's one technique I'd like to suggest. Another one I'd like to suggest is this. Most cognitive psychologists would say there's probably dozens of dysfunctional ways of thinking. So it could be like all or nothing thinking, could be mind reading, could be overgeneralizing. One that I'd like to direct your attention to right now that's very common in a pandemic, come to find out, is a thing I call catastrophizing. I'm taking what's true, here's the data that's before me, and extrapolating out to the worst case scenario. That's how catastrophizing works. So I'd just like to introduce a couple of techniques if you catch yourself catastrophizing. I know a woman. She's a mother of an adult child who is 24 years old and she's graduated college, had a great job lined up. Well, what do you think happened in the midst of this pandemic to that job? It's dwindled and it looks like it's going to go away. This mother's catastrophizing. That career that she prepared for, went into student debt for, is going to go away. Maybe she won't even get to do this career. That's her catastrophizing. In working with me, she had a look at that and was able to recast that. And here's the technique I'm going to suggest. I'm going to call it the then what technique. Like if that worst case scenario were to happen, let's just engage it. Then what? Okay, so she's lost her job. Then what? Well, she was able to say she's 24. Maybe the job could come back on the other side of this. But if that doesn't happen, she's 24. She's got options that she can work with. And in the meantime, she's got us, and we will help her. Notice the shift in mood that took place for her. Look at the possibilities that opened up with that new way of constructing meaning. Then what? Here's another technique you can use with catastrophizing. I have found with my clients, it doesn't do much good to try to talk them out of their catastrophic scenario. Better to say this, okay, there could be a lot of truth in that. But here's the thing, it's also possible that we could generate 2 more hypotheses that could also be at least as possible, maybe even more possible. I talked to a man this week who said, we're just going to have to struggle through this in an open-ended way till it ends. Check out how that just shuts down possibilities. Another hypothesis he was able to generate went like this. Together, by supporting each other, there will be struggles, but we're going to make it through. Check out the way that he was able to generate another hypothesis and go with that. It just changes the mood of things and it opens up possibilities. The final thing I want to talk about has to do with how we construct stories. I want you to imagine for a second, I've got this painting that's a little on the dark side, and it's got a frame around it of those kind of peel and stick phosphorescent daisies from the 60s all the way around it, just garish, not good looking at all. I want you to imagine that I finally said, I got to get rid of this, and I'm taking it to the street, and my neighbor sees it and goes, wait a minute, Tom, hold on here, and pulls that frame off, goes in their house and brings out a beautifully painted gold frame and puts it with it, and we both go, my goodness, that's a Rembrandt. The reframing goes a long way in cognitive psychology, my meaning construction. When I notice that I've framed meaning in a way that shuts down possibilities, can I reframe it in a way that opens up possibilities? An easy example to pick is whenever you hear someone's story starting with the words, I can't, or I'm not able to. If I can take that story, and there's a spectrum of ways to reframe it. One way would be, I'm not very good at that right now. A little bit of possibilities opened up right there. If I move on down the spectrum, maybe I could say, I'm working on it and I'm getting better at it. Check out the shift in mood. Check out the possibilities that open up as I begin using language in that way to construct my meaning. Abraham Heschel, that great 20th century rabbi, mystic, philosopher, he said this. He said, words create worlds. What I notice in the time we're in right now is that words also can tear down our world. And so our resilience challenge I want to issue to you and to me this week is to be very conscious about how it is that we make meaning and to make conscious effort to deploy those words that create, deploy those words that open up possibilities. Next week, we'll get back together again for more of an ongoing conversations that breaks open possibilities and is saturated with creativity. I'll see you next week.